Hello all. Today we will be talking about Faces, the episode in which the Vidians make their return in order to try and split B'Elanna Torres into two, with much character development involving therewith. There's a couple things I would like to talk about first and foremost before we really get into this. As usual, this is because this is the first time this has come up. If you've been watching this series, you get the pattern by now. The first thing I want to talk about is teasers. Star Trek, most especially in the TNG and on era, has this very basic format, and pretty much every single episode has followed it. I only say that because I can't think of an exception, but there might be that I don't know about. There's a teaser, which is variable in length. Then there's the opening credits, and what by that I mean, the title crawl, da da, awesome music is playing for this section, and then it actually gets to the episode proper, right? It is also worth noting that Star Trek tends to have both very good and very bad teasers in all three of the shows that really exemplify this concept. One of my favorite examples of a truly bad teaser, if you'll forgive me for segueing for a second, is in a TNG episode. And I can't think of the name of it. It's the one that deals with the Irish settlers in the one colony and the clones on the other one, if you know the one I'm talking about. That is one of the worst teasers I've ever seen. Why? Probably because it flat out lies to you. See, the teaser is them discovering a distress signal, and then, oh my god, Worf has fallen over, and he's collapsed on the bridge, and there's tense music, and Data's like, medical emergency, and then, and teaser, right? That is, well, for those of you who haven't seen the episode, the Worf dilemma is literally resolved before the first act. He just has a disease, a common illness. That's it, and that's all. But for those of us watching it as it came out, that was a real attention grabber, which is what a teaser is supposed to do. It's supposed to do it about something actually related to the plot, usually, but, whatever. And I mention that because that's so ludicrous. That's like at the beginning of, well, actually, Deep Space Nine had a similar problem, not with a teaser, but with something else. In an otherwise fantastic episode, one guy says, "I am dying," and then there's commercial break. Then he comes back. When someone like me says I'm dying, it just means he's old. I forget his exact words, but it was so utterly hackney that I almost felt like they were winking at us as they were writing the scene. And I tend to not like that type of teaser, and I tend to point to, obviously the DS9 one wasn't, but I point to that episode of TNG as one of my favorite examples of how not to do a teaser. Voyager itself has several problems with this. In fact, there's another one which some people would probably argue is even worse because it's completely disinteresting on top of completely lying. It's an episode we haven't reached yet where it's the holo novel thing. I've talked about the holo novel before. Janeway's little Jane Andrews or whatever story thing. And the whole teaser, which is quite long, is this holonovel. And then all of a sudden, the man walks up in the holonovel and says, "Oh, I love you," whatever your character's name is. I can't remember the character name. And then that's the teaser. That cut to the opening credits. Really? That's what you wanted to go with the teaser? So my point is that Star Trek has its good and its bads when it comes to this. This is actually probably one of my favorite teasers I've ever seen in Star Trek for this episode. It's only 32 seconds long. Yes, I actually counted. And it is incredibly simple, and it gets all the information across in just those 32 seconds. We see a woman being held up like this. She has somewhat dark skin, and we hear someone talking about some technobabble, which I don't recall right now. And then you hear, "B'Elanna? B'Elanna Torres, wake up." And she raises her head, and we see that she's a full Klingon. Cut to credits. That is exactly what a teaser should be. This is something that is directly and intimately related to the episode, and it catches your attention immediately. Now, I'm not saying a teaser should necessarily be short. I have seen long teasers that have been pulled off properly. For the uniform, or no, for whichever one was the second one in For the Uniform and For the Cause. I can never remember which one came after the first one. I'm not good with names. You probably know that by now. But that teaser was something like 4 minutes long, and yet still was actually pretty good in my opinion. I mention this here because I feel like praising this episode, this entire episode. This is going to be a very positive review. I have so few things to complain about in this episode. Really, I do. So let's go ahead and move on to the second point here. This is a little bit off topic, but I felt like mentioning it here because, well, it'll be relevant to the very next point I'm going to bring up, okay? A friend of mine and I recently had a discussion during which we were discussing the flaws of Star Wars, the original series and the extended canon, right? The reason I mention this is he had linked me something that was making fun of how flawed Star Wars was, and it was two people who were yelling back and forth about it, blah, blah, blah. Some of you may have even seen this clip. The discussion came up from the fact that he basically was saying Star Wars is flawed. Now, some of you out there may be, mind you, I am of course a Star Wars fan, if I haven't made that clear, but some of you out there might be thinking the same exact thing I was thinking, which is to say, and water is wet. What's your point? I don't actually get where he was going with that, and he wasn't going anywhere. He was just trying to make a joke. But the point I was trying to make is that um, everything's flawed. That's kind of life. We don't like the things we like because they're perfect. We like the things we like because they're the things we like. I could use an allegory in relationships, for example. You know, the woman or man or whatever of your life that you have either that you're happy with or in love with, even if it's only for a temporary period of time, is not perfect. I'm sorry, I hate to break this to you. But that's not really the point. They aren't perfect. You aren't perfect. We aren't perfect. We are flawed. We grow close to each other because of those flaws, and regardless of those flaws, depending on your individual perspective on the matter, right? It's the same type of thing with just about anything, really. I could point to my favorite work of fiction of all time, Final Fantasy VI, which I hold in such a high pedestal that nothing else has ever hit it to date. I was actually just recently playing it, not a few weeks ago. That's how much I love that game, right? It's still flawed. That doesn't change the fact that I love that game, though, right? And so it's the same thing with Star Wars. Yes, there were so many problems with those original movies. No, really, there were. And I know there are certain people out there, especially fanboys, who would just rail and rail at me for that, but it doesn't matter. Because I'm not saying Star Wars was bad. Does that make sense? I am saying Star Wars was flawed, and water is wet. I still love Star Wars. I think Star Wars is awesome. I think Star Wars has its bads as well as its goods. It's actually in a very similar boat as to Star Trek, if you think about it. If you think about the whole franchise as a conglomerate, we've got awesome, we've got good, we've got horrible, and we've got disgustingly bad way over here on the side. It just kind of covers the gamut. I just don't get. I just wanted to mention that as a to give a little bit of insight into the way I think about this sort of thing. And indeed, I think that's a very relevant thing to Voyager, because Voyager is, let's face it, very flawed. I still enjoy watching it, though. I mentioned before one of the reasons I picked up on Voyager so fast when it was one of the shows that was recommended, or it was requested in the shows for me to look at, or books and whatnot, was because Voyager's a series I love to think about. It really engages my brain, right? But one of the other reasons is I like watching this show. I do, honestly. One of the reasons I really like doing this, and one of the reasons I insist on doing the episode by episode thing, is because I like rewatching these episodes. I literally sit down and I watch an episode, and I start recording within a couple of minutes. The time it takes me to set up the camera and the microphone and all that. That's the difference in time between me doing this and me watching the episode. I still have trouble with names sometimes, but that's just me. I don't think there's anything I can do about that unless I just start carrying around little index cards. Okay, Blob and George and Jill and God, I can't even think of names right now. Anyways, now this all leads directly into my next point. In Star Trek, this is true in fiction in general, but Star Trek tends to exemplify this. We have to accept things that are silly, ridiculous, or stupid. I shouldn't say we have to. Oftentimes, fans such as myself choose to, not because we're just trying to protect it because it's Star Trek and therefore by being Star Trek it's better, but because oftentimes those episodes or those movies that have silly, ridiculous, stupid premises are awesome. Have excellent writing, have excellent directing, have good acting, have good music. I point to Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, as my favorite example of this that most people are aware of. That is a movie that has an absolutely stupid premise, and yet is awesome, enjoyable, still funny to this day, in my opinion. I know many, many people who enjoy that movie, and its contribution to the franchise as a whole is almost incalculable because, well, I don't want to get into the details, but the point remaining, that's the movie, in case you aren't aware, where they have to go save the whales in order to save the planet from a giant can of air freshener. That movie was awesome, despite the silly thing. You get where I'm going with this? Oftentimes we have these ridiculous premises or stupid ideas and concepts, and yet the episode and or movie pulls it off. This is another one of my favorite examples of this, and I tend to use this example for people who are aware of it. Phasis' general premise, spoiler alert, I'm going to go ahead and give you a moment to. Okay. Is that the Vidians have taken B'Elanna Torres and literally split her in two. There is a human Torres and there is a Klingon Torres. Fortunately, they don't actually waste a lot of time on technobabble. The total explanation for this separation takes maybe 3 lines of dialogue, and that's it. And I'm not even going to begin to get into the point of how absolutely ludicrous this concept is. Really, I'm not. Especially since, from the way it's presented, and definitely from the way it is thematically, neither one of these is B'Elanna Torres. The effect of if you were to think about it in terms of the intangible, what we are effectively told is that B'Elanna Torres was destroyed to make these two twins who both have her memories, and then this one dies, spoiler alert, so that this one keeps going on, still having the memories from the original and being re-merged with her original DNA in order to become the hybrid again. And that's kind of a silly premise when you really think about it, when you really sit back and go, huh. And yet this episode is absolutely fantastic, arguably one of my favorites of the first season. I know I've said that several times. Part of the reason is because I actually forgot Faces was a season 1 episode. Seriously, I did. When I said, Blah is my favorite episode, I actually forgot about this episode. And really highlights my point, if I can get it. But let's go ahead and move on here. Let us continue on. One of the things that's amusing about Voyager, and I've heard this comment before, is that every time you expect it to suck, or even want it to suck, it doesn't, if that makes any sense. This will come up much more strongly in a later episode, which is the first Q episode. I actually can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. The one with Q and Quinn. But this episode is probably the first example of this. For those of you who don't know what I mean, every now and again Voyager does this thing where they'll take a really dumb idea and something they shouldn't do. In this case, in my honest opinion, it is the recurrence of the Vidians. I mentioned before how I thought the Vidians should be a one-off, and I did not think they made a good recurring baddie. So the Vidians coming back, in my opinion, thematically and in the construct of the whole series, was a mistake. And yet they made an awesome episode out of it. Similarly, when I get to Q, I'll talk about this more, but the return of Q into Voyager at all was, in my opinion, a mistake. And yet that first episode was actually really good. So, come on, Voyager, help me out here. This is something that will crop up more, and I'll mention it as we go, but this is a definite example of this. In fact, if I had my way with regard to changes, one of the things I would probably do is make this be the first appearance of the Vidians as we see them, and I'll actually talk about that more when we get to the actual changes, but let's move on, shall we? There was this, as usual, every single. I should start keeping count. I should start making a drinking game or something of this. Even though I don't drink, so I should make a drinking water game. Yeah, out of this, because every time this comes up, I just feel like I'm repeating myself. There is a scene right at the beginning of this with Tuvok and Neelix. Now, as I've mentioned before in my changes, one of the things I would have done is pushed the friendship of those two characters much earlier on. And in my opinion, this would be an excellent scene in which to develop that. One of the things that Neelix says is he insists that everyone has the right to a little bit of a taste of home. Okay? And he offers Tuvok a dish, a Vulcan dish, a traditional Vulcan dish, that Tuvok himself has reputed to enjoy. All of this makes perfect sense and is awesome right up until the moment we find out that Neelix actually changed it because he didn't like the original taste. In literally one change, one little niggling altercation to this scene, we have gone from Neelix is kind, thoughtful, generous, and trying to help people in a real way to being just kind of a bastard. And in a really, I can't even use the words I want to right here, but let's just say it isn't good, okay? And leave it at that. And I just find myself, again, the reason I keep saying this keeps coming up is I keep seeing these scenes with Neelix, which were clearly designed with this in mind, and then someone comes along afterwards and says, no, 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 Neelix is our comic character. You have to make it funny by making him an idiot. Okay, well, I guess he could mess with the recipe, even though that'd be a really stupid thing to do and completely contrary to his point. Yeah, comedy gold, man! Really? You want... Okay, I'll rewrite Neelix as a 2 IQ retarded 2-year-old if you really want me to. I... Anyways, I'd just like to mention right now, in my changes section, I wouldn't change this scene at all except for that fact. I would have made it actually a dish, and I would have had Neelix and Tuvok just talk very briefly about the concept of home, especially since... I'll go ahead and say this here, okay? The very next episode is Jatrell. This is an episode I've been looking forward to talking about for a while, and one of the ones that I was most looking forward to when I started talking about Season 1 in general. For those of you who don't know, I'm not going to spoil it, but one of the things I would have as a lead into Jatrell here is as they start, Tuvok sips it and Neelix is waiting anxiously for some kind of response because he wants to know if he did it right. And Tuvok says this is very authentic and compliments him. As I've mentioned before, my Neelix actually has cooking skills rather than, anti-cooking skills. And Neelix would be overjoyed at this. Awesome, this is one of the most difficult dishes I've prepared. And he reveals in kind of his rambling nature that he's actually tried making this dish like 5 or 6 times and it kept coming out not quite right. And he really wanted to make it well. And Tuvok says, I do not understand why you went to such effort for such a simple thing. I would have accepted a simple dish. And Neelix says, yes, but I wanted it to remind you of home because I know what it's like not to have a home. And before he can elaborate on that, before he can elaborate on his statement right at the end there, which he didn't even mean to say, it just kind of slipped out. That's when Janeway calls him to the bridge, and Tuvok says, if you'll excuse me, and we leave Neelix. And I would have had a scene where him, walks over to the viewport, and he's looking out the window. And I know Ethan Phillips could pull this off. He'd just give this sort of melancholy sigh as he looks out, and that's it. Just this little hint. That's all we'd need. And then we move on with the rest of the episode. Now, I want to mention something about Durst. For those of you who don't recognize the name, Durst was actually an extra introduced in the last episode, whose name I suddenly can't think about. Cathexis, that was it. I mentioned this because this is another thing Voyager is actually going to do quite a bit, and it feels like they almost didn't do it on purpose, and yet at the same time they did very badly, if that makes any sense. One of the things that TNG and DS9 especially were rather well known for was having C and D cast list members who were pretty regular. Miles O'Brien himself is actually a beautiful example of this from TNG era. He didn't even have a name for a decent portion of the development of the show, and I don't even remember if they actually named him in Season 1. I don't recall. But the point is, he was just another red shirt, right? And there's a lot of times they did that where they would have a recurring C or D list cast member who would be in several episodes until they actually started to develop a little, or the actor moved on. That kind of recurrence is something I like and something I would like to do if I ever did a television show myself. If nothing else, it enhances the idea that this is the same crew you're seeing every week, especially on a show like Voyager, where you are literally seeing the same crew every week. Someone actually sat down and did a tally of how many people die over the course of this show, and it's kind of ludicrous. And you actually start thinking about the numbers of how many people had to have been roaming around the ship during this whole series. It's given how many of them we see, and how many of them we only see once. It's kind of silly when you get down to it. All of this is preamble to explain what Voyager does, which is very strange. They have two off, okay? Rather than one-off extras who are only in one episode, they have two offs, and 9 times out of 10, these two offs are killed in the second episode in which they're in. They're in an episode and they're like, "Hey, I'm here. What's going on?" And they're just another extra, just like any other. Sometimes they're not even named, and then they return in the next episode, and usually they're named, which you of course know is the death knell because now we know they're going to die in order to prove the situation is serious, or whatever. A good example of this would happen much later with the Borg as well, and Hogan in Season 2, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Durst is a great example of this because this was clearly and decisively done not on purpose. He was cast as just a random guy, and then he got the role for the Vidian Doctor. And so they decided to go ahead and through the circumstance of this, merge the two into that wonderfully horrific scene where he's wearing his own face, basically, if you follow me. Because, I don't know if you knew this, he's the guy who plays the main Vidian Doctor, whose name I don't know, in this episode, the guy who played Durst. And I just find that amusing and morbid and horrible all at the same time. I don't even know how to react to that. But when he's like, I thought you'd find this face more appealing. That's actually him with just a little bit of additional makeup and, of course, the rest of the back thing on. Very amusing. I would like to give them credit for planning it, but I know better, unfortunately. Let's see here. What's my next note? The horror of the Vidians is what I wrote down. I like the way they used the Vidians in this episode. One of the things I mentioned that they did wrong with the Vidians in the previous example of it, and indeed this will happen as well in the future, is they tried to portray them as sympathetic. Now don't mistake me, I like a sympathetic antagonist as much as anyone else. In fact, I rather enjoy sympathetic antagonists more than most other kinds. But in my opinion, the Vidians, the way they are designed, the way they're written, should not be sympathetic any more than I can't even come up with a better example off the top of my head. I mean, these people are pretty horrific when it gets down to this. I mention this because in this episode they make absolutely no attempt to make the Vidians sympathetic. They portray their perspective rather well, actually. The guy who plays Durst Vidian, I can't remember his name again, is really does a really good job at getting a lot of backstory about the Vidians out. Much of this we've already heard as well, but he gives it in a unique light. The previous people were much more dichotomized in the first episode. In this one, he just demonstrates that while he wants to cure his people, while he wants to get to a point where they're not like this, he is obviously either morally bankrupt or simply someone who has become so jaded that it doesn't mean anything to him anymore. He, without question and hesitation, kills one of the members of B'Elanna's crew just to look better for her. He, without hesitation or question, threatens to kill the other B'Elanna just in order to get her to cooperate. He, without question or hesitation, goes ahead and infects B'Elanna with the phage and finds it fascinating that she can withstand the excessively extreme amounts of pain she's in. This is the kind of sick and twisted individual that this man is, and all the Vidians are portrayed in such a horrifying light. There's a lot of throw-off comments that I was listening to in this episode. I don't think I even noticed them in previous viewings. One of my favorites is when B'Elanna is being taken away, and she's like, "What are you doing? Where are you taking me?" And one of them says, almost as an aside, for a warm bath and a hot meal. Now, you know what they're actually doing is taking her to organ processing, which is just as horrific as it sounds, by the way. The mere fact that they can so casually, jocularly make such a comment like that really speaks to the mentality of the Vidians. This episode probably forms a lot of my opinions on the Vidians because these guys are bad guys. No, really, these guys are bad guys. Whatever horrors have been visited upon them, they have gone way past the moral boundary. They have gone way past the point of no return. They are the enemy at this point. And if every single one of them died, who is like this, I might add, because obviously the possibility exists of Vidians who are not like this. But if everyone who is like that, monster, who is joking with a woman about the fact that he's about to rip her guts out in order to use himself, died, if every single one of them was wiped out of existence, the galaxy would probably be a better place for it. That's what these Vidians are, and I actually do like this portrayal of it because it's a lot more unambiguous, and it gives the show its first real, unequivocal bad guy. I still don't think they should have been recurring, but I'm getting ahead of myself on that one. But let's really talk about this. I mean, when I say the horror of the Vidians, I'm not talking about just the visceral, they look disgusting thing. Although definite props on the makeup. They did a very good job on that. These are people who are so weak themselves that they are forced to use slave labor. Now, let me make something very, very, very clear right here and right now. There are very few things I take a truly strong, absolute stance upon, and slavery is one of them. I am so opposed to slavery, I don't actually have words for it. The very thought disgusts me, to put it a little bit frank. In several works of fiction, slavery is often portrayed in a slightly lighter light than it happened in real life, because of simple romanticism and the fact that this is a television show, not real life. And I'm okay with that. That does not excuse it. I'm not talking about the writers, okay? I'm not saying the fact that they had slave labor in their show is a bad thing. I am saying the Vidians, within character, within the setting, are irredeemable. These Vidians are irredeemable for this simple and solitary fact that they used slave labor. And then we compound that by the knowledge that they work these slaves to death, basically, and when they are too weak, too injured, too ill taken care of either from disease or fatigue or from lack of food, they just haul them off and take their organs. Something about that strikes me as more horrible than if they just worked them to death. The knowledge that you have to work as hard as you can, as well as you can, for as long as you can, otherwise not only are you dying, you're getting dissected. You're getting turned into a nice big Lego jamboree. Something about that really just bothers me on several levels, and is another reason why the Vidians are so vilified in this episode. And I want to stress again the term organ processing. They never show it, which is a very good thing. They never have to. The term organ processing is really all you need to say. The mind fills in all the blanks there, and it is not pleasant. Let's move on. I have to give very strong praise for Roxanne Dawson. She's the woman who plays B'Elanna Torres. I apologize if I'm pronouncing her name wrong. This woman does a phenomenal job in this episode. I wanted to mention this here because it occurred to me as I was doing the notes in this order, but it happens over and over again throughout the whole episode. She portrays Klingon Torres and human Torres, both quite different, all things considered, and yet ultimately you can still see B'Elanna Torres there if you follow me. It's not like she didn't go to extreme. She didn't caricaturize herself. Klingon Torres still had cunning, still had her intellect, still thought ahead, was still willing to listen, still cared, and human Torres still had some of her fire, some of her courage, some of her, my point is these weren't so dichotomized that it was ludicrous. She plays both roles basically perfectly and extremely well. And I guess I'll go and mention this here in this section because it looks like I didn't make a second note about it. This whole episode really is B'Elanna Torres' episode. One of the comparisons I've made in the past was to Best of Both Worlds Part 1. Now, obviously, I consider that to be a better episode than this. I mean, duh. But the overall style of presentation is the same. While the Borg are indescribably important to the Best of Both Worlds Part 1, go rewatch that episode sometime, and you'll see exactly what I'm about to say is true. That episode is a William Riker episode. He is the primary focus of almost all of that episode. Even with the stuff dealing with the Borg, it is his viewpoint, it is his stance, it is his character development, it is his hesitation, it is his courage, it is his growth as a character that drives so much of that episode. Now don't mistake me, the Borg, that's probably the best presentation of the Borg I've ever seen. No, that is the best presentation of the Borg I've ever seen, in Part 1 specifically. But it is a William T. Riker episode. You follow me? In a similar vein, while the Vians are a very crucial part of this episode, and indeed none of this would have happened without the Vians, and the portrayal as the villains is excellent and crucial to the story, this is B'Elanna Torres' story. You follow me? Everything we hear in this episode is about her. When I was getting to the changes section, which I am going to be doing after this time, except for the little note I mentioned about the Neelix scene, I found myself hesitant because I liked this as episode so much that I didn't want to change it. The Torres thing, as ridiculous as it is on paper, is so crucial to the way this episode turned out. Literally physically separating the two sides of Torres gave us, the viewers, and them, the writers, the possibility to literally show us B'Elanna Torres' internalized problems, if you follow me with here. And show us her as a character. This whole episode expands upon and expounds upon B'Elanna Torres so much that arguably 90% of what we know about that character comes from this sole episode. Now, I'm not to say that she doesn't have other good episodes, but this is probably her best one in my personal opinion. If there's another one I can't think of off the top of my head, forgive me. But this explores so much of her. It is not just done to be cheap. It's not just done to switch up the costumes or the makeup for an episode. We genuinely learn about her, and I really like that. I really like the way that is portrayed. We also see. Well, I'll leave that for the end, but I just really want to expand upon this fact. That is why this episode is so great. Not because the Vidians are horribly evil, not because of the whole competency thing, which I'll mention next, not because of the other little nitpicks and details that make things good in this episode. No. It is the fact that this whole episode. Imagine for a moment if you actually had the capacity to do what you do in a book in an episode. That's basically what this is. For those of you who don't know what I mean, in a book, you can actually switch to a person's perspective. And thus we, the viewer, know that what they are thinking is what they are actually meaning. And what I mean by that is anything a character says, especially someone who is circumventive or duplicitous, is by its nature something we have to question, right? We're not sure if that's who or what they really are. Gul Dukat is a beautiful example of this. There is a debate that rages to this day about Gul Dukat as a character, because so much of what we heard is from his perspective, from his words, from his voice. If this was a book, you could have actually gone into his head and seen what was real, what wasn't, what he actually thought, how crazy he actually was, that kind of thing, right? Now, in this episode, through this ludicrous premise, they have brilliantly brought that into this, because now we see Torres and Torres talking to each other, no one else around. And this happens on several occasions, and thus, through their interactions, we know for a fact that this is actually B'Elanna Torres, if you follow me. It's the same perspective we are allowed from a book standpoint, because everything that that B'Elanna Torres usually internalizes is now being vocalized as the two literally argue with each other. And in that you can see the conflict that has defined her character and I should say will continue to define her character for the most of the series, literally being played out right in front of us. While it is again, like I said, literal, and some have said it's a little bit too overt. In my opinion, this is the only way you could pull this off within a television setting properly, and I think the actress does a sufficiently good job with the scenes and playing the two different roles, and the writers really did a good job on this one. That I don't think it's too overt. I think it's basically just right. We really do learn a great deal about her. Hate to keep bashing that in, but it's so rare to see such genuine character growth and examination within Voyager. To date, we've only actually seen this twice, arguably three times. I'd argue three, but the Doctor and this episode with Torres are the two big ones. And for those who are wondering, I'd argue Tom is the third one, which I'll get to in just a second, because that's in this episode too. Competence. I mentioned that before. This whole episode presents the crew of Voyager being competent. I like that. I like the thought that these people we're watching every day actually have a brain. That may sound like a strange statement. Again, water's wet. But so often in Voyager, a lot of plots, this is true in TNG as well, and DS9 and many other shows, a lot of plots of individual episodes only happen because the crew was stupid. The only reason the dilemma exists is because they were stupid, because they didn't plan for blah, or they didn't think about blah. And I'm not talking about really complicated stuff. I'm just talking about the kind of thing that we, the viewers, are shouting at the screen within the first 10 minutes of the show. That kind of thing. So, this is an episode where the Voyager crew isn't stupid, like at all. The whole time they display a stunning level of competence, and it's actually kind of funny because it is so stark in contrast to most of early Voyager that it just kind of emphasizes how bad they usually are and have been to date, given how much I notice it here when they are being genuinely competent. Allow me to give you a specific example that I enjoy personally a great deal. In just a few episodes ago, in Heroes and Demons, I talked about how I talked about the difference in emergency and how Star Trek tends to deal with emergencies in the same way we would deal with stubbing our toe, right? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, tough. You can go watch the episode if you want to. But in relation to that, they talk about how they're going to have a continuous transporter lock on the away team, right? Now, this is a phrase they've used before, and it has never been true until this episode. Every other time that I've lost signal, and if you have a continuous lock on someone and you lose signal, you don't mention it when you are trying to beam them back. You mention it the moment you lose signal. That's how that works. This is not complication. This is not overthinking it. This is not technobabble. This is just common sense. If you're on the phone with someone and you lose a connection, guess what? You're going to notice the moment it loses connection. Especially if you're trying to talk to, I don't know, 911 or something actually important. I'm sorry, I don't mean to imply that phone conversations aren't important. I'm trying to get across the point that this is usually a situation that isn't just a casual conversation, but rather life or death. In this episode, they have this continuous transport lock. And I remember when I first saw it, I literally just rolled my eyes like, oh god, I've heard that phrase like 4 times already in this whole series. And they see a couple of vians. They shoot a shot not intended to kill. It's very directly designed to make them back off. Chakotay says, 3 to beam up. And within 2 seconds, they're gone. The whole altercation takes about 6 seconds. From spotting the enemy to being gone and safe. Wow. That is exactly how it should be. This is that competence on display. They use several instances of it. The whole breadcrumbs thing was another good example, and the whole the method by which they deal with the vians, the disguise, the custom outfit, all this stuff. There are quite a few examples of competence in this episode, and it really was enjoyable for that factor. It really helped highlight the episode. I mean, if it had still just been Torres and the crew was stupid, I would still like this episode, but I wouldn't love it nearly as much. I liked the fact that this is actually our second view at a Talaxian ever, believe it or not. It's really weird because I feel like 2 writers wrote the Talaxian. Because the very first scene we see him in, he's an irritating little prick. Now, it is entirely possible, and I've heard some people argue, that he was simply mad. And given the circumstances, I would not blame him. Again, slave labor until you die to organ processing would probably be the kind of thing that would drive me mad. Just guessing here. But I mention it in contrast because later on he is extremely helpful and extremely kind and selfless and giving all in one simple gesture. And those of you who've seen the episode know the scene I'm talking about. And then later on, he is cooperative and helpful. And I found myself actually being sad. And for a very, very simple reason. There is another change I would make as I go. That's not an overarching change. I'm going to mention it here. I would have made several of the characters make a point of trying to save the other prisoners, especially that Talaxian. Especially given the next episode to Trell. But moving on. Even ignoring that, I think they should have tried to rescue as many other people as they could, especially since they had successfully shut down the force field so they could just literally beam up every non-Vidian. Boom, just like that. It wouldn't even be hard, if you understand me. It would probably take, I don't know, a few seconds to get that kind of signal lock, depending on how many slaves are, I admit. But given the competency that was shown in the rest of this episode, I think that's pretty feasible, all things considered. Now, I mentioned Tom Paris here, and I actually have a whole note that just says Tom Paris and a quote, which I actually wrote down so I wouldn't misquote it. Throughout this whole series, Tom Paris has been an interesting character. We have learned a decent amount about him. He has not had any episodes devoted to him. Instead, we have learned about him in other episodes, through his actions and through his counteractions and through little snippets, bits and pieces. We have seen a bit of a tapestry, bits and pieces of the tapestry that is this character, but we have never actually focused on him like we do with Torres or the Doctor. This is one of the reasons I say he has been the third character to actually receive real characterization and growth within this series so far. This is another good example of that, believe it or not. First of all, he says one thing that is obviously kind of a mistake to say when he talks about his haircut. It's obvious that what he's doing is trying to disarm Torres, human Torres. He's trying to bring a degree of levity to the situation by presenting something that is just kind of like silly, if you follow me, But then Human Torres keeps going, and he doesn't have any other quips or anything like that. He just listens and is very sympathetic, and you could see the empathy just rolling off of this man. And he demonstrates it not only in his portrayal, but in his acting and in his words. On several occasions, he basically says, we're not going anywhere. We're not doing anything until we find out what happened to Torres, and we need to know what happened to Durst. Blah blah blah. There are several times when he is very clearly the caring person that he is, and it's on display, and it's very well done. One of the other things I like is Tom Paris kind of automatically takes command of the situation. I have heard arguments that Tom Paris would make a bad commander. He is not command material. The reason for that argument is because he cares too much. Yes, really. I understand the logic there. I really do. But having seen other commanders who do care just as much, it is my opinion that I think Tom would make a good commander in the same vein that Picard or Sisko did. Because both of those were very caring people who cared an immense deal about the people in their command and felt every single one of those losses personally. Whether or not that is true or untrue is irrelevant because on many occasions Tom kind of does take command. Not literally. He doesn't say, I'm in charge here. He just kind of does it. You know what I'm talking about? Most of these are emergency situations of some sort or another, like this one, where he just kind of he just does it. He doesn't actually say, all right, I'm going to be taking command of this prison scenario. No, he does, and I mention that because in several other episodes of Voyager as well as Star Trek, someone will say, okay, I'm now taking command of the situation, and will actually make a point of it. Tom never does that. He just does it. He just says, okay. He tries to take care of his people, tries to analyze the situation, tries to work on a solution. And this is another excellent example of that. He has a beautiful quote, which I actually wrote down and I would like to share with you. Courage does not mean that you do not have fear. It means that you have learned to overcome it. I love that quote. And that was the perfect thing to say to Human Torres in the moment that he did, and probably helped her a great deal with the events that were about to happen. Because one of the problems Human Torres has was that she was cowering. And she's not even entirely sure why, but she has never felt so gripped by fear in her life, in her memory. And learning to overcome that is in fact something that she does through the course of this episode. And one of the reasons that Klingon Torres accepts her in her death, You showed true courage in the end, thus my death has honor now. That kind of a thing. And I really liked that. Speaking of that whole death of the other Klingon, death of the other Torres thing, I should say. Right at the end, we find out that the reset button is going to be hit. This is one of a very, very small number of times when the reset button was hit that I am actually fully in favor of it. The Doctor explains it both perfectly logically and in a way that actually does not involve technobabble. It's very simple. Her cells are not producing protein properly because her body was never designed to just be human. She was born a hybrid. Hybrids don't work that way, especially in hell, that doesn't work way here in real life with animals and fruits, for goodness sakes. Two alien species merging like that is almost assuredly going to have a similar problem. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of made-up science here because we don't know what the interaction is between Klingons and humans in mating, because they're fictional. But it makes perfect sense, and again, didn't involve, we need to quantize your subcellular structure and you blah, 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 blah. I can't even do it. I can't even do technobabble. Instead, it was just very simple. We need to reinitialize this DNA, remerge that form of her with you in order to bring you back to your standard state so that you can live, is really all it boiled down to. And the beautiful part is it wasn't just done to hit the reset button, it was done to impact her. I've talked before about continuity in Voyager, and this is another time it will come up. It will come up many times. I will mention it every single time. This is another one of those elements that I would have had matter. I would have had carry forward into the future, just like the death of Freya back in Heroes and Demons. This is something that should be mentioned, or at least acknowledged in the future. Because Torres has this beautiful little speech where she's talking to Chakotay afterwards, and she says, I feel at peace with myself for the first time in my whole life. And that's a good feeling. But I also feel incomplete. And in that, we see the truth of the situation, that it is more complicated than just, I need to be, real me or whatever. There's nothing trite about it. There's nothing hack about it. It's just a human being. A very human sensation of not being sure of what you want or how you want it, but nevertheless accepting the path forward. And the most perfect part of all is that Chakotay doesn't say anything in response to this. He actually opens his mouth to speak a couple times. Props to Beltran. He does know how to do his stuff whenever he's allowed to. And then he closes his mouth and kind of looks down because he realizes that there basically is nothing he can say. And that's exactly how it should be. And then, end of episode, right? Brilliant episode. Love this episode. Now let's talk about my changes. I already mentioned a few niggling details, so I'm not going to recover those. It is an irony that literally one episode after I decided to lay down my new rule to myself of trying to keep this new Archie and Gaia's Voyager canon contiguous throughout this whole series of videos I'm doing, that I run into this episode, the episode I wanted to change the least, and yet in order to keep the canon I would have had to change the most. I finally found a little bit of a way around it that almost feels like cheating, but I like the way it runs in its own right. Let me explain a little bit. While I am obviously in favor of bottle shows, both literal and figurative, and I suppose that's actually metaphorical and figurative, but anyways, I also like the idea of having an undercurrent. Just because they have entered Terranok space and have just learned of the Conclave does not mean that is always going to be the primary plot. Even over on Battlestar Galactica, the Cylons were not always the primary plot. I point to the episode, actually I don't know the name of it. It's the one where they are dealing with the prison ship. This is very early on in Battlestar Galactica, and the figurehead over there, the guy who was the revolutionary, who basically takes several people hostage and starts making demands, and they have to resolve all that. That episode was not about the Cylons. The undercurrent was still there, and we did still have the scenes with Balter? I can't remember his name. The guy I hated. Dealing with the Cylon detection device and all that. But, at the end of the day, that episode was not focused on it. It was an undercurrent. You see where I'm going with here. As I've mentioned before, the Terranok are not a species. They are an alliance of species, very similar in overall concept to the Federation, all things considered. Now, the Terranok, at one point in time, a decent period of time ago... Well, actually, that's a lie. Let me take that back. The Terranok were not good people, okay? Ultimately... Well, I say they were similar to the Federation, but I don't... I mean, actually, I might call them similar to the Dominion, except without the founders and the Vorta and the Jem'Hadar, which many people are like, well, is there anything else left? You know what I mean, though, an alliance of people, but they are ultimately not the most morally helpful, nice, whatever, polite civilization around. This is one of the reasons the Conclave actually decided to go ahead and make them a city, effectively a city-state, make them a member of the Conclave, was because there were so many issues that were happening at the edges of Conclave space that was initiated by the Terranok. In other words, if you see where I'm going with this here, the Terranok brought this on themselves, okay? Now, the Terranok Alliance had pretty decently advanced medical technology, and were using it to try and work on the usual things you'd imagine, longevity vaccines, that kind of thing, right? I mention that just because that'll be important for the sake of this episode. And one of the really big themes I've had with the Terranok Alliance is that they are incredibly prideful. The fact that they are members of the Conclave chafes them to no end, and it's the kind of thing that would actually bother a member of the society. If you actually said, "Are you a member of the Conclave?" they would probably initially vehemently respond, "No," because they consider themselves an occupied state, and they are constantly seeking to undo that. One of the things they have to do then is all the different projects and endeavors that they undergo basically have to be done in secret as much as possible. Secular design, cell-based structure of organization, that kind of thing, in order to try and ensure that news doesn't get back to the Conclave that they're either having problems, which the Conclave will use as a very correct political excuse to walk in and take over that section of their existence, thus removing more of their independence, or B, find out that they're plotting against the Conclave, which the Conclave will also take as a sign to move in and say, okay, military, boom, we're taking over. This is another of those examples, okay? I'm in my version of this, all this exposition would be given by the gentleman who played the Vidian Doctor in bits and pieces. Probably also by the Talaxian, I would imagine. In this episode, we learn that a particular world of the Terranok with a species whose name doesn't matter, we'll call them, what's on my screen right now? No, that doesn't work. No, that doesn't work either. I've got a bunch of Mega Man characters on my screen. I'm looking at them like, no, not the bubble crabs. No, not the vials. No, not the scarabs. It really doesn't matter. I don't know why I'm obsessing over this. The Bob species had an outbreak of a pretty bad plague. The planet was quarantined, but then very quickly they realized that if any word of this got out, the Conclave would immediately move in and basically say, okay, we're taking over. So they have had several elite um, groups, basically, whose entire purpose has been devoted towards fixing this plague, and they have a rather large operation in place, which is consuming a decent amount of resources and time and effort, I might add, designated towards hiding this plague, which is one of the reasons that they've never encountered it before. And this would be mentioned by the Talaxian, for example, that, I didn't even know there was a plague until I started staring it in the face. Now, this is a species-specific plague. There's a term for that, and I can't remember it. It's a real-life thing. For those of you who played Mass Effect 2, you're familiar with the concept, if nothing else, on that front, because, the whole thing at on the Omega asteroid, that the outbreak that Morden was trying to cure. That kind of a thing, right? So only the Bob species is actually a threat for this. Now, one of the things that is being considered is actually the annihilation of the planet. This would also be mentioned by the Vidian Doctor, or the Bob Doctor, I should say. Sorry. That one of the reasons he is so motivated in helping his people, I would make him a member of the Bob species, by the way. One of the reasons he is so motivated in helping his people and carrying this plague is because they will all be destroyed. Because the Terranok Alliance would rather have them wiped out than risk anything being threatened in their political position with the Conclave. And I would try to get the actor to get the despair of the tone of that statement in his mind, because I want you to realize what he's saying here. The political stance of the people who run the region that his planet happens to be in have decided I'm saying my sentence structure is horrible. The people who run the region that his planet happens to be in have decided their political stance with their overlords is more important than his species' survival. Because they could just go to the Conclave and say help. And the Conclave would help. They would take over, but they would help. You follow me? But they have decided that their independence is too important to them. And I would try to get the bitterness across in his tone in so many of his portrayals. Now, these people, again, I want to stress, are not really good people. I would not change the fact that these are basically irredeemable pricks. The line to human Torres, for example, is a good example of that, and the fact that he is, without question and without shame, infected Klingon Torres. I would also make just a casual comment somewhere that the whole reason that they believed that Klingon DNA or Klingon genetics basically I hate to use the word DNA because the show tends to use the word DNA like it's the magic thing, it's the magic button or whatever. But Klingon genetics, Klingon immune system would be the key to defeating this phage. Would be something that Seska would have recommended because Seska is still working closely with the team, which is basically part of this conspiracy I've mentioned, for lack of a better term, the organization within the Tarnak Alliance that is running things and also trying to keep everything distant from the Conclave, something Seska herself also agrees with, by the way, not that we'd find that out for a while. So she suggested this whole operation, and they got Torres on this planet that they were stopping on because it had some minerals or another, and of course, go figure, those minerals are actually actively being mined by the slaves of the people they keep here in order to keep, I would keep the body harvesting thing. I would keep the organ processing thing in. If you're paying attention, all I'm changing is the background. Nothing is actually changing in the episode. They're still harvesting these minerals within this place. Why? Because they need to pay for this operation independently. Funding can't come from the government or else there'll be a paper trail. Why are they after Torres? Because Seska pointed them in that direction and they need to solve this thing internally. All these little details are basically me just changing the background and adding a why rather than changing the what. Because I do love this episode. I do love its examination of Torres and its revelation of the other characters. I would also have um, a little bit more exposition on the fact that I would have someone somewhere mention this whole thing about curing this phage and mentioning why it is that they were in such dire straits. And then, even though the point I'm bringing this up is, even though these people are not sympathetic, nor do I want to treat them with a sympathetic light, I could see several people on the ship, when exposed to this information, thinking, would it be so bad to at least give them some information on Klingon genetics and Klingon immune system in order to try and help them in this endeavor? And ultimately, the decision would basically be no. We cannot risk it with a hostile force that has actively kidnapped and was trying to kill, and has killed, members of our crew. The simple practicality of the situation, basically removing the dilemma, but at the same time leaving the thought there that, well, for lack of a better term, this quadrant is already changing around Voyager. That's kind of the point I'm trying to get across with all of this. That Voyager's simple presence has already had a very strong effect on what is happening in this quadrant and will continue to do so. Again, undercurrent. I wouldn't change the episode proper, nor would I try to steer the episode away from Torres in any way. All of this, again, would be relatively small exposition, rather than, for example, him talking about how my people were once sculptors and scholars and stuff like that. He could instead be talking about this sort of thing, rather than having one of the needless figure out what we're doing scenes, which kind of pad the episode out a bit. All you'd have to do is shift that down a little bit and squeeze this over here. It wouldn't be very hard to do, is my point. Now, I'm done. I was going to add one last thing at the end of this. I'm very curious of your guys' thought of the overall Conclave storyline that's been forming as I go. And so if any of you want to leave any comments or toss me any messages or put something on the forums, feel free. I'm very curious of your thoughts. Either way, I'll talk to you in the next video.